Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, or whatever it is, wherever you are. Now, imagine, if you will, the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., being captured by an invading force, and its public buildings, including the White House, being set ablaze. Now, this is exactly what happened near the beginning of the 19th century. So let's take a look at the events that led to Great Britain capturing Washington and setting the White House ablaze. In the years leading up to 1812, tensions had been rising in North America. The fledgling nation of the United States that had fought so hard for its independence 30 years before was looking to expand its territory and had its eyes on British-held Canada. Both the British and indigenous native peoples were wary of the United States and its hunger for more territory. Britain's Royal Navy dominated the North Atlantic and had been harassing French trading vessels crossing the Atlantic since the War of Independence. But in 1807 the British began enforcing even stricter restrictions. The United States was split on what action to take in response. In 1812 the British sent concessions to the US in an effort to avoid war. The journey across the North Atlantic took many weeks, and by the time the concessions had reached them, the United States had already declared war on Great Britain. It was too late. Britain was already on a war footing as it was in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and she responded by enforcing a complete blockade of the eastern coast of the US. The US immediately attacked the Canadian border. An American army commanded by William Hull invaded Upper Canada on the 12th of July, arriving at Sandwich, Ontario after crossing the Detroit River. Hull sent a warning to the Canadians.
The horrors and calamities of war will stalk before you.
The proclamation said that Hull wanted to release them from the tyranny of Great Britain, giving them the liberty, security and wealth that his own country enjoyed. He also rather menacingly threatened to
kill any British soldier found fighting alongside indigenous fighters.
However, to Hull's dismay, his proclamation only helped to stiffen resistance to the American attacks. Hull retreated on the 7th of August 1812. He was defeated, as was the American attack and attempted invasion of Canada. This attempted invasion of Canada by the USA was just one attempt of nearly a dozen during this war.
The burning of Washington and the White House.
Further south, in August of 1814, British General Ross, with around 2,500 soldiers on a flotilla of nearly 20 vessels, met up with Admiral George Cockburn and the 3rd Brigade with 4,500 men, and proceeded to attack Washington. Washington was quickly captured and looted. General Ross directed his troops to set fire to the White House and a number of other public buildings. This was supposedly in retaliation for the burning of Canadian settlements by the Americans. There was extensive damage to the interiors and contents of these buildings. Thankfully, private residences were ordered to be spared. Now, to this day, scorch marks are still visible on the White House, as you can see in this photo. In 1949, President Truman embarked on a 3-year refurbishment of the White House. The interior was totally gutted and rebuilt. But a couple of areas that showed these 1814 scorch marks were left unpainted. Now, of the items looted from the White House, there were paintings of King George III and Queen Charlotte, and an official government receipt book. Now, after the attack, the Royal Navy sailed to Bermuda, and this is now where the paintings hang. Now, the burning and looting of Washington was in retaliation for the American attacks on Canada, and the Americans during these attacks looted hundreds of items from Canada, including a Royal Standard, the first Mace of Ontario from Canada's Parliament, and hundreds of other items. Most of these items today can be seen at the US Naval Academy in Annapolis in Maryland. Okay, let's finish to the conclusion of this war. After the looting was finished, the British moved out of Washington and towards their real target, the fortified city of Baltimore. The British had occupied Washington for around 26 hours. During the Battle of Baltimore, in an attempt to capture Fort McHenry, British General Ross was killed by an American sniper. This paused the British attack momentarily before it continued. After suffering heavy casualties, the British realised that they could not take Baltimore and retreated. They then bombarded Fort McHenry for 25 hours straight. The defence of Fort McHenry inspired the poem written by Francis Scott Key that was later used as the US anthem, The Star-Spangled Banner. The war officially ended on the 17th of February 1815, when the Treaty of Ghent was ratified by Congress. The terms called for all occupied territory to be returned, the pre-war boundary between Canada and the United States to be restored, and the Americans were to gain fishing rights in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The British insisted on the inclusion of provisions in Article 9 of the treaty which called on both signatories to restore to the Indians all possessions, rights and privileges which they may have enjoyed or been entitled to in 1811. The US saw the war as a second war of independence and celebrated what they felt was a victory. In Great Britain, the war was greatly overshadowed by the fight against Napoleon and the French Empire, and to this day is not very often talked about. In fact, most Britons would be surprised to hear that their country set the White House ablaze. The Native Americans that allied with the British lost a lot of territory, and on top of this the Americans refused to agree to the British proposal of creating a Native American state of their own in the American West. Let's take a look at some of the facts and figures. So here we have the commanders, firstly of the American side, and then the British side. And here we see the relative strengths of each side. The US with a home advantage had far more men, with nearly 500,000 militia. But the UK had more native support. Here are the casualties. It seems that the Americans lost a lot more soldiers than the British. The Native Americans allied to the British also took heavy losses. And that concludes our brief look at the War of 1812 and the burning of the White House. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.